Welcome once again to another late night with warm whiskey. Tonight, this is part 2 of our exploration of offerings from the Colonel E.H.Taylor line of whiskeys. Yesterday, we covered the E.H.Taylor small batch bottled in bond. Tonight, we are going to cover the straight rye bottled in bond. And we'll just cover the whole topic of bottled in bond while we're at it, in case there's anybody out here watching who is not aware. Anybody who's in whiskey circles or bourbon should be pretty well aware of the designation of being bottled in bond. But for those of you who may not know, we'll get into that a little bit as well. But for now, I'm going to go ahead, dive in, give a little bit of nosing to this Colonel E.H.Taylor straight rye. And of course, it is bottled in bond. A very floral, herbal nose. A wonderful note of toasted oak, riding right on the backbone of all of that. Slightly, somewhat evergreen quality to the nose of this. And if you give a little bit of time and come back to it, there's definitely some of that classic dill, cinnamon, classic rye nose, classic rye palate on this. So this is a non-age statement product. There is no age stated. We know it's bottled in bond, so it must be a minimum of 4 years old. And given the fact that I've spent some time with this, the consensus on the old interwebs seems to be that this is probably around a 9-year-old whiskey. And I tend to agree with that. That wonderful toasted oak nose leads me to believe it's got a few more years than the 4 it takes to make a bottled in bond whiskey. Then there is the pricing point on this. You're going to find this for around $80 if you find it for retail or manufacturer's suggested retail price. And probably above that if it's by other means. The mash bill on this is not disclosed either. But Buffalo Trace has 2 mash bills. They have their standard rye mash bill, and then they have a high rye mash bill. Your standard rye mash bill is probably being used for your Sazerac rye, a barely legal rye. So to be a straight rye whiskey, you must be at least 51% rye, just as bourbon must be 51% corn. To get that straight rye designation, you need to be at least 51% rye. And there are a lot of what we call barely legal ryes out there. Your Baby Saz, Rittenhouse. These are rye whiskeys with a good amount of corn following that 51% minimum rye content. So their high rye mash bill consists of rye and malted barley. So you're omitting the corn. And inherently, that takes away a lot of the sweetness that comes with that corn being in the mash bill. So this ends up being a much more layered, spicy, less sweet whiskey. There still is a sweetness to it, but it is not as sweet as some of your barely legal rye offerings. So with that said, we'll dive in see what arrives on the palate. The nose is really, really enticing. The after finish of this, the exhale, all of that dill, cinnamon, allspice, definitely that wonderful toasted oak is translating to the palate as well too. It resides on the nose and goes right into the palate. Finish on this is, I would say, medium, not too long. Does not linger, but still, even now, after that initial tasting, still getting a pretty good after effect from that. And so this is one of those ones where, you know, we're looking at this, and the price point of this being $80 more if you're getting it from other sources. There are plenty of other ryes out there that could go toe to toe with this and cost you half the price. With that said, the Colonel E.H.Taylor line is highly coveted, sought after, as many of your other Buffalo Trace products are, your Blanton's, your Elmer T. Lee, or Stagg Jr. Even these days, sadly, Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare are getting a little bit harder to come by than they ever have been. They are trying to boost their production, but we'll see how all of that plays out in the long run. As of now, the trend is not slowing down. They are still the hottest whiskeys, bourbons on the market, and the most sought after. So, let me get back to the Bottled in Bond Act that was passed in 1897. As I said in my video yesterday, Colonel E.H.Taylor was one of the key figures in pushing for that to be passed. It was one of the first quality control acts ever passed in the United States, and a good example of needed regulation. There were all sorts of shady, underhanded, volatile practices going on within the spirits industry before the passing of that act. So it laid down some very strict stipulations. Must be a product of one distilling season, one distiller, must be aged in federally secured and supervised bonded warehouses for a minimum of 4 years. It must be bottled at 100 proof, so 50% alcohol by volume. Anytime you find a bottled in bond product, if it bears that on the label, by law, it has to be 100 proof. Not one below, not one above, exactly 100 proof. And that was a quality assurance for a product that in that day and age was very misleading. You know, Old Forester was the first to bottle whiskeys. Before that, you would go into a general store and you would bring your own vessel and they would tap a barrel and fill it for you from there. But there were speculators, rectifiers, and there was all kinds of fuckery being committed to disguise whiskeys, stretch them out, try to make them appear to be older than they are. You can look up some of the secrets of the rectifiers online and see some of the very atrocious volatile things that they would do to some of these barrels, because they were easy to be tampered with. You know, it's You can pop the old bung, you can tap it, but there is plenty of room for manipulation and contamination of that product. So the Bottled and Bond Act was one of the very first quality control acts passed in the United States. And to this day, it still stands, and it is one of the strictest set of rules for a spirit. And it does not have to be bourbon. It can be rye, it can be brandy, it can be rum. As long as it is bottled, aged, it can be a bottled and bond whiskey. And we should be thankful for those measures, and thankful to Colonel E.H.Taylor, who led the charge to get that act to pass. We now have some very fine, high quality whiskeys that we can enjoy with confidence. So, this will wrap up part 2 of this, and we will move on to the Colonel E.H.Taylor Barrel Proof, which falls out of the Bottled and Bond designation in part 3 when it creeps above that 100 proof mark, so it can no longer be considered or called a Bottled and Bond whiskey. But uncut, unfiltered barrel proof whiskey is an amazing thing, and until then, I look forward to covering that and hope you enjoyed this. Skål!